The bullet tore through Rebecca Walsh's thigh 3 miles outside of McGill, Nevada, and in that single moment of searing pain, she knew her life would never be the same again. The year was 1882, and the stagecoach robbery had happened so fast that Rebecca barely had time to scream before the outlaws were gone, leaving behind 2 dead guards and 5 terrified passengers bleeding into the desert dust. She had been traveling from Salt Lake City to meet her sister in Ely, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and dreams of starting fresh in a new town. Instead, she found herself lying in the dirt, watching her own blood seep into the Nevada sand while the other survivors scrambled to help. They managed to get her to McGill, a small mining town that had sprung up alongside the copper deposits, where a tired doctor with whiskey on his breath did his best to save her leg. He succeeded in keeping her alive, but the damage was done. The bullet had shattered bone and torn through muscle, leaving her with a limb that would never quite work right again. She spent 6 weeks in a cramped room above the general store, learning to walk with a cane, feeling the pitying stares of strangers, and wondering what kind of future waited for a crippled woman in a place as unforgiving as the Nevada desert. By the time Rebecca could hobble downstairs on her own, autumn had arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and a restlessness she could not shake. Her sister had written twice, urging her to continue on to Ely, but Rebecca could not bring herself to leave. Something about McGill had gotten under her skin, perhaps the stark beauty of the surrounding mountains, or perhaps simply the fact that she had survived here when she might have died. She took a job helping at the general store, sorting inventory and keeping the books, work she could do sitting down. The pay was modest, but it came with a room, and the store owner, a widow named Martha Chen, asked no questions and offered no pity. It was on a crisp October morning, while Rebecca was arranging canned goods on a shelf, that Quentin Ortega first walked into her life. He came through the door with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, his boots dusty from the trail and his hat pulled low against the morning sun streaming through the window. Rebecca noticed him immediately, not because he was particularly handsome, though he was, with strong features and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, but because of the way he moved. There was a gentleness to him that seemed at odds with the gun belt at his hip and the weathered look of a man who spent his days under an unforgiving sky. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried the faint accent of someone who had grown up speaking Spanish before English. "I need supplies for a week on the trail. Salt pork, beans, coffee, ammunition for a Winchester." Rebecca nodded and began gathering the items, acutely aware of her awkward gait as she moved around the store. She had grown somewhat accustomed to the cane, but she still felt self-conscious, especially around strangers. Quentin watched her work, but his gaze held none of the pity she had come to expect. Instead, he seemed merely patient, waiting without hurry or judgment. "You are new to McGill," he observed as she wrapped the salt pork in brown paper. It was not quite a question. "A few months now," Rebecca replied, keeping her voice neutral. "And you?" "I have a small ranch about 10 miles north of here. Cattle, mostly, though the land is not particularly generous." He smiled slightly, and the expression transformed his face, softening the hard edges that wind and sun had carved there. "I come to town once a month for supplies and to remind myself that other people exist." Despite herself, Rebecca smiled back. "That sounds lonely." "Sometimes," Quentin admitted, "but I prefer my own company to bad company, and good company is rare enough." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet honesty that made Rebecca look at him more closely. She guessed he was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two older, with the lean build of someone who worked hard for everything he had. His hands, as he counted out coins to pay for his supplies, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who knew what it meant to struggle. "How did you come to have a ranch out here?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her usual reserve. Quentin's expression grew thoughtful. "My father worked in the silver mines in Virginia City. He died when I was 16, and my mother went back to her family in California. I stayed, worked as a ranch hand for 10 years, saved every penny and bought the land 4 years ago. It is not much, but it is mine." The simple pride in his words resonated with something deep in Rebecca's chest. She understood what it meant to want something of your own, to build a life from nothing. Before the robbery, she had dreamed of opening a small dress shop, of making beautiful things with her hands and earning her own way in the world. That dream felt impossibly distant now, but hearing Quentin talk about his ranch reminded her that some dreams could survive even the harshest circumstances. "That sounds like a good life," she said softly. "It could be better," Quentin replied, and for a moment their eyes met, and Rebecca felt a flutter of something she had not felt in a long time. Then he was gathering his supplies, tipping his hat politely and heading back out into the bright Nevada morning. She told herself not to think about him, but over the next few weeks, she found her thoughts returning to the quiet rancher with the gentle manner and the lonely homestead. When he came back to town 4 weeks later, her heart gave an embarrassing leap, and she scolded herself for acting like a schoolgirl. She was 24 years old enough to know better than to develop feelings for a stranger. But Quentin kept coming back, always on the first Saturday of the month, and each time he stayed a little longer, talking with Rebecca while she worked. He told her about his cattle, about the challenges of running a ranch alone, about the coyotes that harried his herd, and the unexpected beauty of watching the sun rise over the Egan Mountains. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her parents who had died of fever when she was 19, about the sister who was the only family she had left. She did not tell him about the robbery, not at first. The memory was still too raw, too tangled up with shame and anger and grief for the life she had lost. But Quentin never asked about her leg, never let his gaze linger on the cane that had become such a permanent part of her existence. He treated her like a whole person, not a broken one, and that gift was more precious than he could possibly know. Winter came to McGill in a fury of wind and snow, and with it came trouble for Quentin's ranch. He arrived at the general store in early December with ice in his beard and worry in his eyes, buying twice his usual supplies. "Storm coming," he told Rebecca grimly. "A bad one, according to the old-timers. I need to make sure I have enough to last if I get snowed in for a few weeks." Rebecca felt a pang of concern that surprised her with its intensity. "Will you be all right out there alone?" Quentin's smile was tired but genuine. "I have survived 6 winters on that ranch. I will survive this one too." He hesitated, then added, "Though I will miss our conversations." 4 weeks is a long time when you are stuck in a cabin with only cattle for company. "I will miss them too," Rebecca admitted, and the warmth in Quentin's eyes told her that her words had pleased him more than she had intended. The storm hit 3 days later, blanketing McGill in 2 feet of snow and driving everyone indoors. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in buckets overnight, and the wind howled through the gaps in the walls like a living thing. Rebecca spent her days huddled near the potbelly stove in the general store, helping Martha serve the few customers brave enough to venture out, and her nights wrapped in every blanket she owned, listening to the storm rage outside. She thought about Quentin constantly, wondering if he was warm enough, if his supplies were holding out, if he was lonely in that isolated cabin with nothing but snow and silence for company. She told herself she was being foolish, that he was a capable man who had made it clear he preferred solitude. But the worry gnawed at her nonetheless, a constant ache beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with the cold. The storm finally broke after 10 days, leaving McGill buried in snowdrifts and the surrounding landscape transformed into a glittering white wilderness. The townspeople dug themselves out slowly, and life began to return to something resembling normal. Rebecca watched the door of the general store anxiously, half expecting Quentin to appear with his easy smile and his gentle manner. But days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks, and there was no sign of him. "Maybe the snow is too deep for him to travel," Martha suggested when she noticed Rebecca's growing agitation. "The roads north of town will not be cleared for weeks yet." Rebecca knew Martha was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease her worry. She found herself lying awake at night, imagining all sorts of disasters. What if Quentin had been caught in the storm while checking on his cattle? What if he had fallen, broken something, and was lying helpless in the snow? What if he needed help and there was no one there to give it? On a Tuesday morning in early January, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. She was going to find Quentin Ortega. Martha tried to talk her out of it, pointing out the obvious difficulties. The snow was still deep, the temperature was brutal, and Rebecca's leg was hardly suited for a 10-mile journey through winter wilderness. But Rebecca had made up her mind, and once she set her jaw in that particular way, Martha knew there was no changing it. "At least take my horse," Martha insisted. "And enough supplies for 3 days in case you get stuck. And for heaven's sake, Rebecca, be careful." Rebecca borrowed a heavy coat, extra blankets, and Martha's sturdy mare, a patient animal named Bess, who had carried her owner through plenty of Nevada winters. She set out just after dawn, following the rough directions Quentin had given her months ago, when the world had been warm and the future had seemed impossibly distant. The journey was harder than she had anticipated. The snow came up to Bess's knees in places, and the cold bit through even the thick coat, making Rebecca's teeth chatter and her injured leg throb with a deep, persistent ache. She had to stop twice to rest, climbing down from the saddle awkwardly and stamping her good leg to keep the blood flowing. Each time, mounting again was an ordeal that left her gasping and sweating despite the cold, but she pushed on, driven by a fear she could not quite name and a determination that surprised her. The old Rebecca, the one who had existed before the robbery, might have given up. She might have decided that the risk was too great, that her limitations made the journey impossible. But this Rebecca, the one who had survived a bullet and learned to walk again, refused to turn back. She found the ranch just before noon, a small collection of weathered buildings huddled against the base of a rocky hillside. Smoke rose from the chimney of the cabin, and relief flooded through Rebecca with such force that she felt momentarily dizzy. He was alive. He was there. She urged Bess forward, and as they approached, the cabin door opened. Quentin stepped out, clearly drawn by the sound of hoofbeats. When he saw Rebecca, his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like joy. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" He was at Bess's side in 3 long strides, reaching up to help her down. His hands were strong and steady, and Rebecca found herself leaning on him more heavily than she had intended as her bad leg buckled beneath her. "I was worried," she said, the simple truth of it. "You did not come to town, and I thought maybe something had happened, and I could not just sit there wondering." Quentin stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "You rode 10 miles through the snow with your leg because you were worried about me." When he put it like that, it did sound rather foolish. Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. "I suppose it seems silly." "No," Quentin said softly. "Not silly. It is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." He helped her toward the cabin, moving at her pace without complaint. "Come inside. You must be freezing." The cabin was small but well built, with a stone fireplace that radiated warmth and simple furniture that looked handmade. Quentin settled Rebecca in the single chair near the fire and began heating coffee on the stove, moving with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to caring for himself. "I did not mean to make you worry," he said as he worked. "The snow has been too deep for the horse to manage safely, and I did not want to risk the journey, but I should have found a way to send word." "You do not owe me explanations," Rebecca protested. "We are barely friends. I had no right to intrude like this." Quentin turned to face her, and the intensity in his expression made her breath catch. "Is that truly what we are, barely friends?" Rebecca's heart began to beat faster. "I do not know what else we would be." "I think you do," Quentin said quietly. He brought her the coffee and crouched beside the chair so they were at eye level. "I think you know that I look forward to the first Saturday of every month more than any other day, that I find excuses to stay in town longer just to talk with you, that I have been thinking about you constantly since the storm hit, wishing I could see you, make sure you were all right." "Quentin," Rebecca whispered, not quite a protest, not quite a plea. "I know I am just a rancher with more dreams than money," he continued. "I know I have nothing much to offer, but if there is any chance that you feel even a fraction of what I feel, I need to know." Rebecca set the coffee aside with trembling hands. "I rode 10 miles through a snowstorm because I could not bear the thought that something might have happened to you." "What does that tell you?" Quentin's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. He reached up and cupped her face gently, his calloused thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "May I kiss you, please?" Rebecca breathed, and then his lips were on hers, warm and gentle and full of promise. They spent the rest of the day talking, really talking, in a way they had never quite managed in the general store with Martha nearby and other customers coming and going. Quentin told her about his childhood in Virginia City, about watching his father come home from the mines each night covered in silver dust, too tired to do more than eat and sleep. He talked about the pride in his mother's eyes when he bought his first cattle, and the loneliness that had dogged him ever since. Rebecca told him about the robbery, about waking up in pain and terror, about the long weeks of recovery and the crushing realization that she would never walk normally again. She cried as she spoke, and Quentin held her hand through it all, his presence steady and reassuring. "I thought my life was over," she admitted. "I thought no man would ever want someone like me, someone broken and useless." Quentin's grip on her hand tightened. "You are not broken. You survived something terrible and you are still here, still strong. That is not weakness, Rebecca. That is courage." "But my leg," she started, and he shook his head firmly. "Your leg is part of you, not all of you, and if anyone cannot see past it to the remarkable woman underneath, they are not worth your time." "What about you?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Can you see past it?" Quentin looked at her with such tenderness that she felt tears spring to her eyes again. "I see a woman who rode through a blizzard to make sure I was all right. I see someone brave and kind and stubborn as hell. Your leg does not change any of that." They talked until the winter darkness fell, and the temperature outside dropped to bone-chilling levels. It became clear that Rebecca could not make the journey back to McGill that night, not safely. Quentin insisted she take the bed while he made himself comfortable on the floor near the fire, and though Rebecca protested, she was too exhausted to argue for long. She woke in the gray light of dawn to find Quentin already up, making breakfast and humming tunelessly under his breath. They ate together, and then Quentin suggested showing her around the ranch before she had to leave. The morning was clear and bitterly cold, but the beauty of the snow-covered landscape took Rebecca's breath away. Quentin helped her navigate the uneven ground, offering his arm when she needed it, and never making her feel like a burden. He showed her the small barn where his dozen cattle were sheltering, the chicken coop where a few hardy hens provided eggs, and the corral where his horses stood hips shot in the pale sunlight. "It is not much," Quentin said, echoing his words from their first meeting, "but I have plans. I want to expand the herd, build a bigger barn, maybe plant some hay next spring. I want to make this place into something real, something lasting." "It already is something real," Rebecca told him. "You built this with your own hands. That means everything." Quentin turned to face her, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes that made her chest ache. "I want to share it with you if you will have me." Rebecca's breath caught. "Quentin, I cannot. I would only slow you down. A ranch needs someone who can work hard, who can keep up, and I cannot do that anymore. You need someone whole." "Then we will take our time together," Quentin said firmly. "Rebecca, I am not looking for a hired hand. I am looking for a partner, someone to share my life with. We will figure out what you can do and what I can do, and we will make it work together. That is what marriage is supposed to be." "Marriage." Rebecca's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Eventually, if you are willing." Quentin took both her hands in his. "I know this is fast. I know we have only really known each other for a few months, but I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I think about you constantly. I dream about building a life with you, and if you need time, I can wait. I can wait as long as you need." Rebecca thought about her small room above the general store, about the pitying looks from strangers, about the future she had thought was lost to her. Then she looked at Quentin, at the hope and honesty in his face, and she knew what her answer had to be. "I do not need time," she said. "I need you. Yes, Quentin. Yes to all of it." The kiss they shared then was deeper than the first, full of promise and passion and the sweet relief of knowing they were no longer alone. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling, and Rebecca felt lighter than she had in months. The journey back to McGill took longer than necessary because they stopped frequently, stealing kisses and making plans. Quentin would come to town the following week, and they would talk to the circuit preacher about a wedding. Rebecca would give notice at the general store and begin packing her few belongings. In the spring, when the weather improved, she would move to the ranch as Quentin's wife. Martha was surprisingly unsurprised when Rebecca told her the news. "I saw the way that man looked at you," she said with a knowing smile. "Like you were the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered. You are a lucky woman, Rebecca Walsh." "I know," Rebecca said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Quentin came to town every few days, helping Rebecca sort through her belongings and making arrangements for their wedding. They decided on a simple ceremony in late February, with just a few witnesses from town. Rebecca wrote to her sister in Ely, and to her surprise and delight, her sister Sarah wrote back saying she would come for the wedding. Sarah arrived 3 days before the ceremony, bringing with her a beautiful dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself. The sisters embraced tearfully, and Sarah examined Quentin with the critical eye of an older sibling protecting her own. "He seems like a good man," Sarah pronounced after Quentin had left them alone to catch up. "And more importantly, he looks at you like you are the only woman in the world. That is what matters." "I love him," Rebecca said simply. "I did not think I would ever love anyone, not after everything that happened, but he makes me feel whole again." "You were always whole," Sarah said gently, "but I am glad you found someone who helps you see that." The wedding took place on a crisp February morning, with weak sunlight streaming through the windows of McGill's small church. Rebecca wore Sarah's dress and carried a bouquet of dried flowers that Martha had saved from her garden. Quentin wore his best shirt and looked nervous enough that Rebecca had to squeeze his hand reassuringly when she reached his side. The circuit preacher, a jovial man named Reverend Hutchins, performed the ceremony with warmth and efficiency. When Quentin slipped the simple gold band onto Rebecca's finger, his hands were shaking slightly, and when he kissed her as his wife for the first time, there were tears in his eyes. They held a small celebration at the general store afterward, with food and drink provided by the townspeople who had grown fond of Rebecca during her months in McGill. Then, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, Quentin helped his new wife onto his horse, and they rode north together toward their new life. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Rebecca had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, and Quentin had to learn how to share space with another person after years of solitude. There were moments of frustration, times when Rebecca felt useless because she could not keep up with the physical demands of the work, and times when Quentin retreated into himself when things went wrong. But they talked through it, as they had promised each other they would. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, found ways to divide the labor that played to both their strengths. Rebecca took over the cooking and the household tasks, managed the chickens, and kept meticulous records of the ranch's finances. Quentin handled the heavy physical work, caring for the cattle and maintaining the buildings. Most importantly, they learned how to be partners in the truest sense. When Rebecca struggled with something because of her leg, Quentin found ways to adapt rather than simply taking over. When Quentin was overwhelmed by work, Rebecca found creative solutions that did not require physical strength. They built their life together one day at a time, one challenge at a time, one small victory at a time. Spring came to the Nevada high desert in a riot of wildflowers and new life. The cattle gave birth to healthy calves, the chickens began laying prolifically, and Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She told Quentin on an evening in late April, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through shock, disbelief, and then pure, radiant joy. "A baby," he repeated as if he could not quite believe it. "A baby," Rebecca confirmed, laughing at his stunned expression. "In October, the doctor thinks." Quentin pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel his heart racing against her cheek. "I am going to be a father," he whispered, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Rebecca asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy." Quentin pulled back to look at her, and there were tears streaming down his face. "Rebecca, I am happier than I have ever been in my entire life. You have given me everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know I needed. I love you so much." "I love you too," Rebecca said, and kissed away his tears. The pregnancy was not easy. Rebecca's injured leg caused balance problems as her belly grew, and by summer she could barely walk without assistance. But Quentin was endlessly patient, helping her move around the cabin and insisting she rest whenever she needed to. He took over even more of the physical work, rising before dawn and working until well after dark to make sure everything was done. "You are working too hard," Rebecca protested one evening in August, watching him return from the fields exhausted and dusty. "I am working exactly as hard as I need to," Quentin replied, kissing her forehead. "You are growing our child. That is the hardest work of all." Sarah came to visit in September, bringing supplies and news from Ely. She stayed for 2 weeks, helping prepare for the baby's arrival and keeping Rebecca company while Quentin worked. The cabin began to fill with tiny clothes that Sarah sewed, blankets that Rebecca knitted in the evenings, and a beautiful cradle that Quentin built with his own hands. The baby came on a cool October evening, arriving after 14 hours of labor that left Rebecca exhausted and Quentin white-faced with worry. But when the midwife from McGill placed the squalling infant in Rebecca's arms and announced it was a boy, all the pain and fear melted away. "Hello, little one," Rebecca whispered, examining her son's tiny fingers and the shock of dark hair on his head. "We have been waiting for you." Quentin sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Rebecca's shoulders, staring at his son with an expression of complete awe. "He is perfect," he breathed. "Rebecca, he is absolutely perfect." They named him James, after Quentin's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he had both his parents wrapped completely around his tiny fingers. Quentin proved to be a devoted father, taking over the night feedings with bottles of expressed milk, so Rebecca could rest, walking the floor with James when he was fussy, and singing soft Spanish lullabies that his own mother had once sung to him. Rebecca had worried that her leg would make it difficult to care for an infant, but she and Quentin worked together to find solutions. They set up changing and feeding stations throughout the cabin, so she would not have to carry James far. Quentin built a special chair with high arms that made it easier for Rebecca to stand up while holding the baby. And when James began to crawl and then walk, Rebecca found that sitting on the floor to play with him was just as effective as chasing him around. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. There were hard winters when money was tight and supplies ran low. There were droughts that left the grazing land parched and the cattle thin. There were sleepless nights with sick children, because 2 years after James came a daughter they named Clara, and 3 years after that, another son named Thomas. But there was also laughter that filled the cabin and spilled out across the high desert. There were summer evenings when the whole family sat on the porch, watching the stars come out while Quentin played the guitar he had bought from a traveling merchant. There were Christmas mornings with simple gifts and elaborate breakfasts, and birthdays celebrated with cakes that Rebecca baked and games that Quentin invented. The ranch grew slowly but steadily. Quentin expanded the herd, built the bigger barn he had dreamed of, and even hired a young man from town to help with the heaviest work. Rebecca started selling eggs and butter in McGill, bringing in extra money that they saved carefully. They never became wealthy, but they built a life that was rich in all the ways that mattered. Rebecca's leg never improved, and there were days when the pain was bad enough to keep her in bed. But she learned to live with it, to work around it, and most importantly, to stop seeing it as a failing. Quentin never let her forget that she was strong and capable, that her worth was not measured by what she could or could not do physically. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quentin gave Rebecca a gift that made her cry. It was a photograph, taken by a traveling photographer who had passed through McGill. The image showed the whole family standing in front of the cabin, Quentin with his arm around Rebecca, James standing tall and serious at 12 years old, Clara grinning impishly at 8, and Thomas, just 5, holding his mother's hand. "I want you to see what I see," Quentin told her, watching as she examined the photograph. "I see a woman who survived something terrible and built a beautiful life anyway. I see a mother who has raised 3 wonderful children, despite everyone telling her it would be too hard. I see my wife, my partner, the love of my life, and I see that you are perfect exactly as you are." Rebecca looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "I never thought I would have this. After the robbery, I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, pitied and forgotten. You gave me everything, Quentin. You gave me everything first," Quentin replied, pulling her into his arms. "You gave me a reason to come home every night. You gave me a family. You gave me purpose and joy and love. I am the lucky one, Rebecca. I have always been the lucky one." They stood there together in the golden light of the Nevada afternoon, surrounded by the life they had built, the children they had raised, and the love that had grown deeper with every passing year. Outside, the desert stretched away toward the mountains, beautiful and harsh and unforgiving. But inside their cabin, inside their embrace, there was only warmth and peace and the quiet certainty of a promise kept. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both large and small. James grew into a serious young man who inherited his father's work ethic and his mother's careful planning. At 18, he announced his intention to start his own ranch on land adjacent to his father's, and Quentin helped him file the claim with pride shining in his eyes. Clara proved to be a talented artist, filling the cabin with drawings and paintings that captured the stark beauty of their desert home. Thomas was the adventurous one, always coming home with scraped knees and wild stories, making both his parents laugh and worry in equal measure. McGill continued to grow around the copper mines, evolving from a rough camp into a proper town with a school, a bank, and even a small library. Rebecca became involved in the community, using the bookkeeping skills she had developed over years of managing the ranch finances to help other families with their accounts. She started teaching basic mathematics to the children in town during the winter months when ranch work was slower, and discovered she had a gift for it. Quentin's hair began to show gray at the temples, and Rebecca found she needed reading glasses for her close work. But they were healthy and strong, their love deepened by years of facing life's challenges together. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when weather permitted, still stole kisses when the children were not looking, still held each other close at night and whispered about their dreams for the future. On a warm summer evening when Rebecca was 43 and Quentin was 49, they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The children were all in town at a dance, Clara having finally convinced her brothers that it would be fun. For the first time in years, Rebecca and Quentin had the ranch entirely to themselves. "You ever regret it?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "Choosing me, I mean. You could have had someone without limitations, someone who could have helped more with the physical work." Quentin turned to look at her with surprise and something that might have been hurt. "After all these years, you still wonder about that, sometimes," Rebecca admitted. "I see how hard you work and I think about how much easier it might have been if—" "Stop," Quentin interrupted gently. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of her knuckles. "Rebecca, I chose you because you are you. Not despite your leg, not in some act of charity, but because you are the person I want to spend my life with. You are brilliant with numbers and you see solutions I would never consider. You are patient with the children in a way I cannot manage. You make this house a home with your cooking and your laughter and your presence. You are my partner in every way that matters, and I have never, not for a single moment, regretted asking you to marry me. Even when I cannot help with the cattle, or when my leg slows us down. We take our time together, remember?" Quentin smiled and lifted her hand to his lips. "That is what I promised you, and I have never felt that promise was a burden. If anything, slowing down has taught me to appreciate what we have built. I might have worked myself to death trying to prove something if you had not been here to remind me what actually matters." Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "How did I get so lucky?" "I ask myself the same question every single day," Quentin replied, and kissed her as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. As the children grew into adults and began to make their own ways in the world, Rebecca and Quentin found new rhythms for their life together. James married a teacher from McGill and started his ranch, coming over regularly to work alongside his father and discuss breeding stock and market prices. Clara moved to Ely, where she found work painting portraits for the mining families who wanted to preserve their likenesses. She visited often, bringing news of the wider world and new paintings for her parents' walls. Thomas, true to his adventurous nature, took a job working for the railroad, but he wrote faithfully and came home every few months with stories that made his mother worry and his father laugh. Rebecca became a grandmother at 47 when James and his wife welcomed a daughter. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Rebecca thought back to that desperate girl lying in the dirt outside of McGill, believing her life was over. If someone had told her then that she would live to see this moment, she never would have believed them. But here she was, surrounded by love, holding proof that survival was only the beginning of the story. Quentin, gray-haired now and moving a bit more slowly than he once had, was a doting grandfather. He carved toys for the baby with patient hands and sang the same Spanish lullabies he had sung to his own children. Watching him with their granddaughter, Rebecca fell in love with him all over again, the way she had done countless times over the years. The ranch continued to thrive under Quentin and James's joint management. They expanded the operation, adding more cattle and even a few horses that Quentin hoped to breed and sell. The work was still hard, but with James to share the burden, Quentin finally began to slow down a bit, to take the occasional day off and spend it with Rebecca. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they took a trip to Salt Lake City, the first real vacation they had taken in all their years together. They stayed in a hotel, ate in restaurants, and walked the city streets arm in arm like newlyweds. Rebecca needed her cane, and they had to stop frequently to rest her leg, but they took their time as they always had and enjoyed every moment. "You know what I remember most about the day we met?" Quentin asked as they sat in a park watching children play. "What?" Rebecca asked, turning to look at him. "The way you moved around that store, so determined not to let your legs stop you from doing your job. You had this set to your jaw, like you were daring the world to underestimate you. I thought you were the most impressive person I had ever seen." "I was terrified," Rebecca admitted. "Every day I was afraid someone would decide I was not worth the trouble, that Martha would let me go and I would have nowhere else to turn. But you kept going anyway. That is courage, Rebecca. That is the quality I fell in love with, even before I knew your name." Quentin reached over and took her hand. "You have shown me what real strength looks like, not the ability to lift heavy things or ride all day without getting tired, but the will to keep going even when life beats you down. You have that in abundance, and you have taught our children to have it too." They returned to the ranch renewed and closer than ever. The years continued their steady march, bringing the expected changes that time brings to all people. Rebecca's leg troubled her more as she aged, and there were mornings when getting out of bed was a challenge. But Quentin was always there, offering his arm, adjusting his pace to match hers, making it clear that they were still partners in all things. Quentin developed a bad cough the winter he turned 60, and despite Rebecca's insistence, he refused to see a doctor for weeks. When he finally agreed, the doctor diagnosed him with a lung infection and prescribed rest and medication. Rebecca nursed him with fierce determination, and after a frightening few weeks, he recovered. But the experience scared them both, a reminder that their time together was precious and finite. "Promise me something," Rebecca said one night as they lay in bed. Quentin finally recovered enough to breathe easily. "Anything," he replied, turning to face her in the darkness. "Promise me that we will not waste whatever time we have left. That we will tell each other everything important, do the things we have always wanted to do, and never take a single day for granted." "I promise," Quentin said solemnly. "Though I would argue I have never taken a day with you for granted." "Me neither," Rebecca agreed. "But let us promise anyway." They kept that promise. They said, "I love you," every day, multiple times. They made a point of sitting together on the porch each evening, weather permitting, just talking and being together. They took small trips when they could, visiting Clara and Ely and Thomas during his rare visits home. They spoiled their grandchildren shamelessly and told them stories about the old days when the ranch was just beginning. On a spring morning in 1902, 20 years after Rebecca had first walked into that general store in McGill, she and Quentin stood together surveying their land. They were both in their 60s now, gray-haired and slower than they once had been, but their hands were clasped together and their love was as strong as ever. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Rebecca asked, leaning on her cane and against Quentin's solid presence. "What is that?" "I think about that girl lying in the dirt after the robbery, believing her life was over. I wish I could go back and tell her that she was wrong, that the best parts of her life were still ahead of her." Quentin put his arm around her shoulders. "What would you tell her?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I would tell her that being broken does not mean being useless, that the right person will not see limitations, they will see possibilities. That slowing down is not the same as giving up, and sometimes taking your time means you get to savor the journey more." She looked up at Quentin with a smile. "And I would tell her that she is going to meet a cowboy in a general store, and that he is going to change everything." "I would tell a younger version of me something too," Quentin said thoughtfully. "I would tell him that he is lonely for a reason, that he is waiting for someone specific, and that when she arrives, she will be worth every moment of solitude he endured." They stood there together, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. Around them, the ranch hummed with quiet life, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens scratching in the yard, the wind whispering through the sagebrush. It was not a grand life by most standards, but it was theirs, built on love and patience and the simple decision to take their time together. Years continued to accumulate like desert dust, softening the edges of everything. Rebecca celebrated her 65th birthday surrounded by her children, their spouses, and 5 grandchildren ranging from toddlers to teenagers. Quentin was 69, still working the ranch with James, though at a much slower pace than before. He joked that he had finally become the old man he had always been destined to be, and Rebecca always responded by telling him he was still the most handsome man she had ever known, because it was true. Time had weathered them both, but it had not diminished what they meant to each other. If anything, the years had refined their love, burning away everything superficial and leaving behind something pure and unshakable. They knew each other's rhythms and moods so well that often they did not need words to communicate. A glance across a room, a touch of the hand, the way Quentin brought Rebecca her coffee in the morning or the way she left his favorite books on the table where he would find them, these small gestures contained volumes. The new century brought changes to McGill and the surrounding areas. Automobiles began to appear on the streets, though they were rare and often viewed with suspicion. The railroad expanded, bringing more people and more commerce. The world was speeding up, but on the ranch, time continued to move at its own measured pace. On a golden afternoon in late September, with the air finally cooling after the brutal summer heat, Rebecca and Quentin celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary. The entire family gathered at the ranch for a party that Clara had organized, complete with food, music, and laughter. Watching her children and grandchildren together, seeing the legacy of love she and Quentin had created, Rebecca felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Happy tears, I hope, Quentin said quietly, appearing at her side with his uncanny ability to know when she needed him. The happiest, Rebecca confirmed, accepting the handkerchief he offered. I am just overwhelmed by all of this. 30 years ago, I never could have imagined this moment. 30 years ago, I was a lonely rancher who talked to his cattle more than people, Quentin said with a smile. Now look at us. We have created all of this together. That night, after the guests had left and the ranch had settled into quiet darkness, Rebecca and Quentin sat together in the cabin that had been their home for 3 decades. They talked about the early days, remembering the challenges and the triumphs, the fears and the joys. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the legacy they were leaving. And they talked about the future, about the years they hopefully still had ahead of them. I want to grow old with you, Rebecca said, resting her head on Quentin's shoulder. You are growing old with me, Quentin replied with gentle humor. We are already old, my love. Then I want to grow older with you, ancient. I want decades more of mornings with you, evenings on the porch, nights falling asleep in your arms. Then that is what we will have, Quentin promised, kissing the top of her head. We will take our time together for as long as we both shall live. And they did. They had 7 more beautiful years together, years marked by the simple pleasures of long companionship. They watched their grandchildren grow and welcomed great-grandchildren into the family. They celebrated holidays and birthdays, weathered setbacks and savored victories. They took their time together through everything, never rushing, always appreciating the gift of each other's presence. When Quentin passed away peacefully in his sleep at 76, with Rebecca lying beside him, she grieved deeply but without regret. They had had 37 years of marriage, longer than many people ever got. They had loved each other fully and completely, never wasting a moment, never taking each other for granted. At his funeral, Rebecca stood before the gathered crowd with Clara's support on one side and James's on the other. Her leg ached, her heart ached, but she stood tall. My husband once told me that we would take our time together, she said, her voice steady despite her tears. And we did. We took our time through every challenge, every joy, every ordinary day. We built a life based on patience and partnership and love that never wavered. I am grateful for every single moment we had, and I will carry him in my heart until we meet again. Rebecca lived another 8 years, surrounded by family, still teaching mathematics to McGill's children, still tending her chickens, still finding joy in the life she and Quentin had built together. She never remarried, never even considered it. Quentin had been her great love, her partner, her home. Nothing could replace that. On a spring morning, 45 years after a bullet had torn through her leg and changed her life forever, Rebecca passed away peacefully in the cabin she and Quentin had shared. She was 84 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all bore the marks of the love and strength she and Quentin had modeled. They buried her next to Quentin on a hillside overlooking the ranch, where the desert wind blew constant and the mountains stood eternal. On her gravestone, beneath her name and dates, James had carved the words that defined her life. She took her time and found everything. The ranch continued, passed down through the family, a testament to what 2 people could build together when they refused to let limitations define them. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the sagebrush and the sun set over the mountains, those who knew the story swore they could feel the presence of Rebecca and Quentin still there, still together, still taking their time through eternity. Their love story became part of McGill's history, passed down through generations as a reminder that the best love is not the easiest love, but the love that endures. That sometimes slowing down is the fastest way to find what truly matters. And that when you find someone willing to take their time with you, through every challenge and every joy, you have found something more precious than silver or gold or all the riches the Nevada desert could ever yield.